I'm John Stevenson, and we're continuing our study of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in our ongoing survey of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. We left off with the destruction of the temple in 586 BC as the Jews are taken from their land and they are deported now to the area of Mesopotamia. Now, we have from a later date, this is not right at this point, but this is a few generations later, in southern Egypt, you go as far south as you can go up the river, and you come to what used to be cataracts. Now there's the big Aswan Dam there, and there's an island there in the middle of the Nile River called the Island of the Elephants, or we say Elephantine. And some papyri were discovered there. These papyri were written, they're written from a Jewish colony, and they're written not to Babylonians, because Babylon by this time had fallen. We're going to see it's a kingdom, but it doesn't last very long, even as an empire. And it's writing to the king of Persia. And these Elephantine papyri, there's a letter there written by the captain of the guard to the Persians asking permission for them to rebuild their temple presumably on the island of Elephantine, or somewhere in this area, where they had a temple to Yahoo, which is just another way of saying Yahweh or God. They had come down here, they had built a temple, and somehow it had been destroyed. And so they are asking permission to rebuild their temple, and where they might continue worshiping God. But it's not to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, is to rebuild a temple here in southern Egypt. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, let's go back and talk about him. He's going to reign from 605 BC. Just as he's taking, in fact, while he's taking Jerusalem, that's when his father had died. He sort of set things up in Jerusalem for that first deportation with Daniel, and then he rushed back home to take the throne, lest somebody else take it in his absence. And so he reigns as the sovereign ruler from 605 BC to 562 BC. We have what are known as the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicles. These are tablet texts written, I'm not sure if he personally writes it, although it's in the first person. That doesn't mean necessarily that he was the one who personally wrote this, but he has maybe a ghostwriter, I don't know. But they record the first 11 years of his reign and describe his battles. It's not storytelling. It's not flowery. It's just very simple. Here's what I did. I conquered this nation and I built this temple, and very very sort of cut and dried. And he records the first 11 years of his reign, but then there's a pause, and we're not sure if it's because we just lost some of the tablets, or remember there's a story that's told in the book of Daniel, how Nebuchadnezzar is struck down, and he's been doing all these things, and all of a sudden it gets very quiet, and his other captains sort of take over for a time. And the book of Daniel talks about a time where Nebuchadnezzar is struck down by God, but then allowed to return, and he continues out the rest of his reign, and in the book of Daniel gives glory to God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is taking Babylon and making it now into a world-class city. The Euphrates River ran directly through the center of the city. Here we have an artist's conception of the river being spanned by bridges, and you have, of course, a ziggurat, because you always had a ziggurat in a major city. That was the temple tower, in this case dedicated to Marduk. You can actually see the Ishtar Gate. It has been taken apart and reconstructed in London. It's at the British Museum. Here's a plaque. Now this one's actually taken from part of the wall, but you actually can go up to the Fine Arts Museum in Boston, and they have a Mesopotamian display, including wall paintings brought from Babylon. In fact, there's pieces of that temple and that city that have made their way to all sorts of museums around the world. So there's our painting of the Ishtar Gate, and then there's the actual Ishtar Gate nowadays in London. A close-up of that. Notice the creatures that inhabit it. Some of them are a bit hard to make out. Some of them resemble almost mythological sorts of creatures. We wonder, goodness, are there, some might be looking at as horses. Some almost look the part of, if you use your imagination, maybe some sort of dragon. Another of the construction projects, now we haven't actually discovered this, but we have all sorts of writings, including that of Herodotus, who tell us about the hanging gardens of Babylon, reputed to be one of the 7 wonders of the world. The story goes that Nebuchadnezzar built these for his wife from Media, who she missed the mountains of her homeland, and so he builds these artificial mountains with running water to water this entire area, where she could look out her palace window and see a marvelous vista looking like the mountains of her homeland. Now we have the Nebuchadnezzar commemoration stela, where he says, "I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to heaven." Sound familiar? And made doors for the gates and covered it with bitumen and bricks. Speaking of some of his building projects, this sounds very much like a temple that he is commemorating. The Babylonian Empire isn't going to last very long after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. His son, Amel-Marduk, the Bible also refers to him as Evil-Merodach, but don't think of that evil as the word evil. It's just what his name sounds like. He reigns for a time, and then Neriglissar is going to reign for a time, and it won't be long before the entire line of Nebuchadnezzar comes to an end, and a new man, a new Chaldean, comes to the throne, Nabonidus, who's going to try to raise up his own dynasty. That's not going to last very long. And he begins to reign, Nabonidus does, along with his son who is regent under him, Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is actually mentioned in the biblical text. Nabonidus had gone to Arabia, and he was doing some, we're not sure, was it military? Part of it was, but a bigger part of it seems to be restoring various temples down there in Arabia. We can think of him as sort of an amateur archaeologist, leaving Belshazzar holding the reins of government back home in Babylon. Meanwhile, remember we had the Medes and the Persians. We're going to talk more about them next time, but the Medes and the Persians are beginning to, well, they've combined under one head. The story goes that a young Persian king, whose father was a Persian but whose mother was a Mede. We'll see next time. Herodotus tells this story. We're not sure if it's true or not, but tells us the story of how that came about. The Medes and the Persians are coalescing into one united kingdom, where we're going to see the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Meanwhile, far to the west, in the kingdom of Lydia, there is a king by the name of Croesus, who is somewhat swelled up with pride. In fact, Solon, the Greek lawgiver from Athens, had come to visit him one day, and Croesus had shown him around his palace and all of his treasures, and said to Solon, "Am I not the happiest man in the world? After all, look at all that I have." And Solon, in his wisdom, had said to him, you should count no man happy until he dies, because you don't know the rest of the story. Well, Croesus thought, well, I can see my story. I'm a great ruler and a great king, and certainly the wealthiest man in the world. And Croesus, according to the story, goes to a Greek oracle, and he's contemplating expanding his kingdom. He sees these Medes and the Persians in the distance, not really too concerned about Babylon. because the king of Babylon's way down south in Arabia doing his own thing. And so he goes to the oracle and asks the oracle, should I attack these Medes and Persians? And the oracle says to him, if you do that, a great kingdom will fall. Now, the oracle doesn't say which kingdom it's going to be, but Croesus takes that to mean the Medes and the Persians are going to fall. And so he goes to war against the Medes and the Persians. And that's exactly the wrong thing to do against this new king of the Medes and the Persians, whose name is Cyrus. We know him as Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus comes up against Lydia and attacks Croesus. Actually, it's sort of a counterattack. And one story goes that he brings the camels up to the front lines, and the horses of Croesus's cavalry will not engage in the battle. Don't know if that's true, but Croesus loses the battle, and he fortifies himself up in the what do you call this? A fortress palace, fortification. Overlooking his own city of Sardis. Now, this is, you can even go to Sardis today. Later on, it would be rebuilt as a Roman city, but before that, it was a Lydian city. And Cyrus comes and surrounds the fortress of Sardis, but as you can see, anything up there, not only you're going to have to deal with the fortress that's up there, but the mountain itself is like a veritable fortress. And you can't very well knock down you can knock down city walls, but knocking down a mountain is another thing entirely. And the story goes that they had surrounded the fortification up on that ridge, and one day a soldier manning the wall up the top of that fortification, he, I guess, started to fall asleep, and he nodded his head, and his helmet fell off and went clattering all the way down to the bottom. And so he looked back and forth to see if anyone was looking, not seeing anybody that was looking his way. He climbed over the wall and climbed down a hidden path that you could not see from far away, got his helmet, climbed back up, went back over the wall, and went back on guard duty. And Cyrus said, well, if he can do that, we can do that too. And so that night, some of his men crawled up that hidden pathway over the city walls while the guards were asleep, and captured the city of Sardis. Now, I tell you that story because when you get to the book of Revelation, you have those 7 letters to the 7 churches, and one of those is a letter to Sardis. And what Jesus says to the people of Sardis is, wake up! He's using that same sort of analogy of what had happened in their day to speak of the spiritual sleepiness that was taking place at a later age. Well, Sardis is captured, and Croesus is captured. And they take Croesus, they put him on a funeral pyre. He's not dead yet, but they're going to burn him alive. And as they are setting fire to it, Croesus is saying, man, Solon was right. You really can't count anyone happy until he dies. And I was just overly arrogant. And Cyrus, who can't speak Greek or whatever language that Croesus was speaking, says, what did he say? Somebody translate for me. And when they translate for him, he's so impressed that the story goes that he releases Croesus. Now, he doesn't say you can be king again, but he spares his life, and he says, it sounds like you've learned a lesson, and you can be one of my advisors, and you can remind me to not be overly arrogant or proud. Next, Cyrus comes against Babylon, and we have several stories about what takes place next. One story is found in the book of Daniel, that Belshazzar is throwing a big party, and he sees some handwriting on a wall, and God says, tonight your kingdom is going to be lost. And Belshazzar calls in Daniel and says, can you read the handwriting? And if you can, I'll give you I'll not make you number 2 man, but I'll make you number 3 man in the kingdom. Couldn't make him number 2 because he's the number 2 man. His father's the number 1 man, but he's down in Arabia. And so Daniel's made the number 3 man, but that only lasts that night. And Belshazzar, sure enough, is put to death. And that's the story that's both in the biblical text, very simple like that, as far as the taking of Babylon, and also in the annals of Cyrus himself. He describes just coming up and taking the city, and there's no mention of a siege or any kind of battle. It seems very sort of open and shut. He just walks in and takes the city. There is a later story that is told by the Greeks, maybe 100 or 200 years later, about how Cyrus captured the city by diverting the waters of the Euphrates. I'm not sure what to make of it. Did it really happen that way? Is that the stuff of legends, urban legends, many hundreds of years later? I don't know. But Babylon falls, and now the Persians will be the new reigning power. In fact, they will be the new rulers of the world. But we'll look at that next time.